Charlemagne, Carolus Magnus or Carolus Magnus, means Charles the Great. He was born in 742 and passed away on January 28, 814. Charlemagne was the king of the Franks from 768 and the Roman Emperor, Imperator Romanorum, from 800 until his death. He expanded the Frankish kingdom into an empire that encompassed various territories across Western and Central Europe. During his reign, he conquered Italy and was crowned Imperator Augustus by Pope Leo III on December 25, 800. This event temporarily made him a rival to the Byzantine Emperor in Constantinople. His rule was closely associated with the Carolingian Renaissance, a revival of art, religion, and culture under the influence of the Catholic Church. Through both military conquests and internal reforms, Charlemagne played a key role in shaping the historical regions of Western and Central Europe. He is recognized as Charles I in the regnal lists of France and Germany, where he is known as
Karl der Große,
and the Holy Roman Empire, as the son of King Pepin the Short and Bertrada of Leon. Charlemagne succeeded his father and initially co-ruled with his brother, Carloman I. However, their relationship was strained, and civil war was only avoided due to Carloman's sudden death in 771. Continuing his father's policies, Charlemagne became a strong supporter of the Pope and removed the ruling Lombard court in Italy. Charles Martel, his ancestor, had once been an ally of the Lombard king, but Charlemagne ultimately allowed his nephew to overthrow the Lombard rule. Charlemagne also launched a military campaign in Spain after being invited by the Muslim governor of Barcelona, who promised to grant him several Iberian cities in exchange for military assistance. However, this agreement was later revoked. During his retreat, Charlemagne's army suffered one of its worst defeats at the hands of the Basques in the Battle of Roncevaux Pass, 778. Later immortalized in the epic Song of Roland. In the east, he waged prolonged wars against various Germanic tribes, particularly the Saxons. After years of conflict, he successfully brought them under his rule, forcing their conversion to Christianity. This consolidation of power helped lay the foundation for the later Ottonian dynasty in Germany. Today, Charlemagne is regarded as not only the founding father of both the French and German monarchies, note, Germany, here refers to Austria, as modern Germany was only established in the 19th century with Prussia at its core, but also as the father of Europe. His empire was the first to unify Western European territories since the fall of the Roman Empire, and the Carolingian Renaissance played a crucial role in fostering a shared European identity. By the 6th century, the Franks had been Christianized, and the Frankish kingdom was ruled by the Merovingian dynasty. It became the most powerful successor state of the Western Roman Empire. However, after the Battle of Tertri, the Merovingians fell into a state of powerlessness, effectively ceasing to rule, war fainéants, do-nothing kings. Almost all governmental authority and decision-making were carried out by the mayor of the palace, Major Domus. In 687, Pepin of Herstal, father of Charles Martel, the mayor of the Palace of Austrasia, ended the conflicts among different Frankish kings and their mayors by securing victory at Tertri. This made him the sole mayor of the palace for the entire Frankish kingdom. Pepin himself was the grandson of two significant figures in Austrasia, Saint Arnulf of Metz and Pepin of Landen. Eventually, Pepin the Middle was succeeded by his illegitimate son, Charles, who later became known as Charles Martel, the Hammer. After 737, Charles ruled the Frankish realms without appointing a king but never claimed the title of king himself. He later passed his authority to his sons, Carloman and Pepin the Short, the latter being the father of Charlemagne. To prevent fragmentation within the Frankish kingdom, the two brothers placed Childeric III on the throne, recognizing him as the last Merovingian king. However, after Carloman renounced his position and entered monastic life, Pepin, with the approval of Pope Zachary, deposed Childeric III. In 751, Pepin was anointed and crowned as king of the Franks. In 754, Pope Stephen II anointed him again, along with his young son, who would later inherit vast territories covering much of Western and Central Europe. Thus, the Merovingian dynasty was replaced by the Carolingian dynasty, named after Charles Martel, Charles being pronounced as Carl, which led to Carolingian right-pointing arrow Carolingian. Date and place of birth. Charlemagne is believed to have been born in 742, though the exact date remains uncertain due to various historical factors. The year 742 was determined by calculating backward from his date of death rather than from any concrete birth record. One alternative birth date is April 2, 747, as recorded in the Annales Petaviani. Notably, April 2, 747, fell on Easter Sunday, a symbolic coincidence that would likely have been remarked upon in historical records. However, no such contemporary references exist. leading some historians to suspect that the Easter birthdate might have been a later invention to glorify the emperor. Other historical sources suggest he may have been born a year later, in 748. Due to these discrepancies, Charlemagne's exact birth date remains unknown. The most reliable estimates place his birth between April 1st and April 15th. 747. Or alternatively, in 748. Possible birthplaces. Charlemagne was likely born in Herstal, a town near Liege, in present-day Belgium, where his father, Pepin the Short, was also born. Herstal was significant as the ancestral home of both the Merovingian and Carolingian dynasties. At around the age of 7, Charlemagne moved to his father's estate in Dupel, leading many historical sources to consider it as a possible birthplace. Other cities proposed as his birthplace include Prum, Duren, Gorting, and Aachen. Name and meaning. Charlemagne, meaning Charles the Great, was named after his grandfather, Charles Martel. His name derives from the Old High German word Karl, Karlas, meaning man or free man, a root that also evolved into Kerl in modern German, meaning man or fellow. In Latinized form, his name appears as Carolus or Carolus. Personal traits. Although no direct accounts from Charlemagne's lifetime survive, his personality is primarily known through the writings of Einhard, a contemporary historian and the author of Vita Caroli Magni, Charlemagne's biography. In chapter 22 of his work, Einhard describes Charlemagne as follows. He was a man of commanding presence, well-built, and remarkably tall, standing at 7 feet. He had a round head, large and lively eyes, a nose slightly larger than average, and white but still beautiful hair. His expression was bright and cheerful, though he had a short and somewhat stout neck. He enjoyed good health for most of his life, except for recurring fevers that troubled him in his later years. Toward the end of his life, he developed a limp, yet he stubbornly continued to do as he pleased, refusing medical advice. He had a strong dislike for physicians because they urged him to stop eating roasted meat and switch to boiled meat, a cooking method he detested. Einhard's physical portrait of Charlemagne aligns with other contemporary representations of the emperor, such as his depiction on coins and the 8-inch bronze statue housed in the Louvre Palace. Height and physical build. In 1861, scientists opened Charlemagne's tomb to reconstruct his skeleton. Estimates suggested that he was around 74.9 inches, 190 centimeters, tall. A modern study, based on shin bone measurements, revised this to approximately 1.84 meters, 6 feet 0.5 inches. Given that the average male height in his time was 1.69 meters, 5 feet 6.5 inches. Charlemagne was taller than 99% of men in his era. Despite his height, measurements of his hip bones indicate that he had a lean frame rather than a particularly muscular build. Facial features and artistic representations. Charlemagne was described as having shoulder-length hair, a strong and dignified appearance, and an unusually thick neck. Roman portrait traditions at the time often portrayed subjects in a half-lit style, symbolizing their personal characteristics. Since Charlemagne was idealized as the model Christian king, his portraits followed a stylized sacred artistic tradition. Many medieval depictions of him show him crowned and as Christ's representative on earth, emphasizing his divine authority rather than his true facial features. The golden hair misconception. Later paintings, including those by Albrecht Dürer, often depict Charlemagne with flowing golden hair. This misinterpretation likely stemmed from a mistranslation of Einhard's words. Einhard described Charlemagne's hair as canati pulchra, which means beautiful white hair. However, through multiple translations and misunderstandings, later artists assumed that he had blonde hair instead. Clothing. Charlemagne typically dressed in traditional Frankish attire, which was simple and practical, rather than the elaborate garments of the Frankish nobility. Einhard describes his clothing as follows. He usually wore the national dress of the Franks, a linen shirt and linen trousers with tight cuffs. Over these, he donned a long, fringed silk tunic, and his legs were wrapped with cloth bands to conceal his lameness in old age. He wore shoes and protected his shoulders and chest from the winter cold with an undergarment made of otter or marten fur. A blue cloak was a staple of his wardrobe, and he always carried a sword. His swords were finely crafted, with gold or silver hilts. For banquets and diplomatic meetings, he wore a specially adorned sword, but despite appreciating foreign clothing, he never permitted himself to wear it. The only exceptions occurred twice in Rome, when he wore a Roman-style chlamys, a short cloak, and sandals. The first time was at the request of Pope Hadrian, and the second was to please Pope Leo III. Regal attire. Charlemagne only wore extravagant garments on special occasions. During major festivals, he dressed in embroidered robes with jewelry, and his shoes were similarly adorned. On such occasions, He fastened his cloak with a golden clasp and wore a large crown. Yet he found this style of dress uncomfortable. According to Einhard, Charlemagne preferred to dress like an ordinary citizen whenever possible. The Wars of Emperor Charlemagne. Campaign in Italy. The conquest of Lombardy. King Charlemagne of the Franks was a devout Catholic who maintained a close relationship with the popes throughout his life. In 772, when Pope Hadrian I was threatened by invaders, the king marched his army to Rome to provide support. In this depiction, the Pope is seen requesting Charlemagne's assistance during a meeting near Rome. Conflict with Desiderius. After Pope Hadrian I ascended to the papacy in 772, he demanded the return of certain cities belonging to the former Archbishop of Ravenna, as promised by Desiderius, king of the Lombards. However, instead of handing over the cities, Desiderius launched an invasion of the Pentapolis and advanced toward Rome. Hadrian sent envoys to Charlemagne in the autumn, requesting him to enforce the policies of his father, King Pippin. Desiderius also sent his envoys to deny the Pope's accusations. The two envoys met at Thionville, and Charlemagne decided to honor the Pope's request. Charlemagne swiftly acted upon the Pope's appeal and vowed not to allow Desiderius to carry out his plans. In 773, Charlemagne and his uncle Bernard crossed the Alps and drove the Lombards back to Pavia, where they laid siege to the city. However, Charlemagne was forced to briefly lift the siege to confront Adalces, the son of Desiderius, who had gathered an army in Verona. The young prince was driven to the Adriatic coast and fled to Constantinople to seek assistance from Emperor Constantine V, who was engaged in a war against the Bulgarians. The siege continued until the spring of 774. When Charlemagne visited the Pope in Rome, there, he confirmed his father's land grants to the papacy. Some later chronicles falsely claim that he extended these grants to include Tuscany, Emilia, Venice, and Corsica. The Pope bestowed upon him the title of nobility. Afterward, Charlemagne returned to Pavia, where the Lombards were on the brink of surrender. To save their lives, the Lombards capitulated and opened the city gates in early summer. Desiderius was sent to the monastery of Corby, and his son Adalces died in Constantinople. In an unexpected move, Charlemagne crowned himself with the Iron Crown of Lombardy and demanded that the Lombard duchies swear allegiance and pay tribute to him in Pavia. Only Duke Aricus II of Benevento refused to submit and declared independence. Charlemagne was then proclaimed king of the Lombards in Italy. He left Italy with a garrison in Pavia and a few Frankish troops stationed nearby. The struggles in Italy. Despite Charlemagne's success, instability persisted in Italy. In 776, Dukes Rodgord of Friuli and Hildepron of Spoleto rebelled. Charlemagne hurried back from Saxony, defeated Rodgord in battle, and killed him. The Duke of Spoleto was forced to sign a treaty of allegiance. Meanwhile, Aricus continued to resist, and Adalces, their candidate for the throne, remained in Greece. Unable to leave Constantinople, northern Italy was now firmly under Charlemagne's control. Southern Italy. In 787, Charlemagne turned his attention to Benevento, where Aricus ruled independently. Charlemagne laid siege to Salerno, forcing Aricus to submit. However, after Aricus's death in 792, Benevento once again declared independence under his son, Grimoald III. Charlemagne's forces, or those of his sons, attacked Grimoald multiple times, but Charlemagne himself never returned to southern Italy, and Grimoald was never forced into full submission to Frankish rule. Charlemagne and his sons. During the first period of peace, 780 to 782, Charlemagne began appointing his sons to rule as part of the traditional governance structure of Frankish kings. In 781, he crowned his two young sons as kings, with their coronations performed by the Pope. The elder of the two, Carloman, became king of Italy and received the same crown that his father had first worn in 774. During the ceremony, Carloman was renamed Pippin. The younger son, Louis, was made king of Aquitaine. Charlemagne decreed that Pippin and Louis be raised according to the customs of their respective kingdoms and granted them regents and control over some of their vassal territories. However, real power remained in Charlemagne's hands, though he intended for his sons to inherit their realms in the future. In 792, possibly due to acts of defiance by his sons, Charlemagne expelled his eldest son and sent his illegitimate son, Pippin the Hunchback, to the monastery of Prum for participating in a rebellion against him. Charlemagne is said to have educated his children well, including his daughters. His sons were taught all the arts and given training in archery, horseback riding, and other outdoor activities, while his daughters were instructed in traditional women's work. As they reached adulthood, Charlemagne's sons were tasked with waging wars on his behalf. Charlemagne sought to conquer the Bretons, who shared a border with his realm, attacking him at least twice. He also launched numerous campaigns against the Saxons. In 805 and 806, He sent armies into the Bohemian Forest, modern-day Bohemia, to subdue the Slavs living there, forcing them to submit to Frankish rule and devastating the Elbe Valley to secure their tribute. Pippin had to defend the borders against the Avars and Beneventans while also fighting the Slavs in the north. He was the only one prepared to engage the Byzantine Empire when tensions arose following Charlemagne's imperial coronation and a Venetian rebellion. Meanwhile, Louis managed the Spanish March and led an expedition to southern Italy to confront the Duke of Benevento at least once. He also captured Barcelona after a prolonged siege in 797. Charlemagne's views on his daughters. Charlemagne's attitude toward his daughters has been the subject of much debate. He kept them at home and refused to allow them to marry men of noble rank, possibly to prevent the formation of rival dynasties. As had happened with Tassilo of Bavaria, however, he tolerated their extramarital relationships, accepted their unions with commoners, and even cherished their illegitimate children. He seemingly dismissed the rumors of their supposed wild behavior. After Charlemagne's death, his surviving daughters were gathered by their brother, Emperor Louis the Pious, and sent to live in a convent, where they inherited their father's estates. At least one of them, Bertha, had a recognized relationship, though not a formal marriage, with Angilbert, a member of Charlemagne's court council. The Spanish campaign. The Roncevaux campaign. According to Islamic historians such as Ibn al-Athir, the Diet of Paderborn met with envoys from the Muslim ruler who governed Zaragoza, Girona, Barcelona, and Huesca. Their overlord had been cornered in the Iberian Peninsula by Abd ar-Rahman I Emir of Córdoba. These Moorish or Saracen rulers offered their lands in tribute and sought military support from the great Frankish king. Seeing an opportunity to expand Christianity and his own power, and believing that the Saxons had been entirely conquered, he agreed to march into Spain. In 778, he led the Neustrian army through the western Pyrenees, while the armies of Austrasia, Lombardy, and Burgundy crossed through the eastern Pyrenees. The armies met at Zaragoza, where Charlemagne received the homage of the Muslim rulers, Sulayman al-Arabi and Kazman Yusuf ibn. But the city did not open its gates to him. In fact, Charlemagne faced one of the most difficult battles of his career, where the Muslims prevailed and forced him to retreat. Deciding to withdraw, he never again placed trust in the Basques, whom he had previously defeated while conquering Pamplona. As he left Iberia and crossed the Roncesvalles Pass, one of the most famous events of his long reign took place. The Basques ambushed his rearguard and baggage train, annihilating him completely. The Battle of Roncevaux was not a battle but a massacre, in which many renowned figures were killed, including Seneschal Egihard, Count Anselm of the Palace, and the commander of the Breton cavalry, Roland. This event later inspired contemporary poets to compose the Song of Roland, La Chanson de Roland. War against the Moors. The conquest of Italy brought Charlemagne into contact with the Saracens, who controlled the Mediterranean at the time. His son Pippin was heavily engaged with the Saracens in Italy. Charlemagne conquered Corsica, Sardinia, and the Balearic Islands in 799. These islands were frequently raided by Saracen pirates, but the Dukes of Genoa and Tuscany, notably Boniface, stationed a large fleet in the bay to secure them until the end of Charlemagne's reign. Charlemagne even had contact with the Caliph of Baghdad in 797 or 801. The Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid sent him an Asian elephant named Abul Abbas as a tribute, along with a clock. In Hispania, battles against the Moors continued unabated throughout the latter half of Charlemagne's reign. His son Louis managed the Spanish March. In 785, his army permanently seized Girona, expanding Frankish control over the Catalan coast during Charlemagne's rule, which lasted until the Treaty of Corbeil in 1258. Muslim rulers in northeastern Spain frequently resisted Córdoba's power and often sought Frankish assistance. The Frankish frontier gradually expanded until 795 when Girona, Cardona, Osona, and Urgel were unified into the newly established Spanish March within the former territory of Septimania. In 797, Barcelona, the largest city in the region, fell into Frankish hands when its governor, Zaid, rebelled against the Emir of Córdoba but was defeated, forcing him to surrender the city. The Umayyads reclaimed it in 799, but in response, Louis of Aquitaine led his entire army across the Pyrenees, laying siege to the city for 2 years, 800 to 801, until it surrendered. The Franks continued their advance against the Arab Emirate, capturing Tarragona in 809 and Tortosa in 811. These conquests brought them to the banks of the Ebro, enabling them to launch raids as far as Valencia. By 812, Emir al-Hakam was forced to submit to their expansion. Eastern campaigns. War against the Saxons. Charlemagne fought almost continuous battles throughout his reign, often leading from the front with his elite Scara bodyguard and wielding his legendary sword Joyeuse. After 30 years and 18 battles in the Saxon Wars, he ultimately subdued Saxony and forcibly converted its people to Christianity when necessary. The Saxons were divided into 4 groups across 4 regions: Westphalia, closest to Austrasia; Eastphalia, farther away; Ingria, between the 2; Nordalbingia, north of the 3, on the Jutland Peninsula. In his first campaign in 773, Charlemagne forced the Ingrians to submit and cut down a sacred Irmintial pillar near Paderborn. However, the campaign was cut short due to his Italian expedition. Returning in 775, he marched through Westphalia, capturing the Saxon fortress of Sigiburg, then crushed the Ingrians and Eastphalians, forcing their leader Hesse to convert to Christianity. He built military camps at Sigiburg and Eresburg, securing control over most of Saxony except Nordalbingia, but resistance continued. After conquering the duchies of Friuli and Spoleto in Italy, Charlemagne returned to Saxony in 776 to suppress another rebellion at Eresburg. The Saxons submitted once again, though their leader, Duke Widukind, fled to Denmark. Charlemagne established a new stronghold, Karlstadt. In 777, he convened a national diet at Paderborn, integrating Saxony into his kingdom, and many Saxons accepted baptism. By 779, he invaded and subdued Eastphalia, Ingria, and Westphalia. At a diet near the Lippe River, he allocated lands to missionaries and encouraged mass baptisms. 780. However, in 782, Widukind returned to lead a new uprising, launching attacks on churches. Charlemagne retaliated with the massacre of Verden, Verdener Blutgericht, reportedly executing 4,500 Saxons who had reverted to paganism after conversion. This event triggered 3 more years of brutal warfare, 783 to 785. After finally subduing the Saxons and Frisians, Widukind accepted baptism, and Saxony remained peaceful for 7 years. However, Westphalia revolted again in 792, followed by Eastphalia and Nordalbingia in 793. But these uprisings were crushed by 794. Another Ingrian revolt in 796 was quickly suppressed. The final rebellion, in 804, saw the last of the Nordalbingians surrender. According to Einhard, the war, lasting many years, ended when the Saxons accepted the king's terms to abandon their ancestral religion, forsake the worship of demons, embrace the sacraments of Christianity, and integrate into the Frankish people. The Avar campaign. In 788, the Avars, an Asian pagan tribe, whom Einhard called Hungarian barbarians, invaded Friuli and Bavaria. Charlemagne was preoccupied until 790 when he led an army down the Danube, ravaging their territory as far as Raab. Meanwhile, a Lombard army under Pippin marched through the Drava Valley, devastating Pannonia. Saxon revolts in 792 interrupted these campaigns. Over the next 2 years, Charlemagne waged war against the Slavs and Saxons. Pippin and Duke Eric of Friuli continued attacking the Avar fortress rings, seizing their capital twice. A vast amount of treasure was sent to Aachen and distributed among Charlemagne's followers, including foreign rulers like King Offa of Mercia. The Avar leadership ultimately submitted, traveling to Aachen to swear loyalty and convert to Christianity. Charlemagne appointed a Christianized native leader, Abraham, as their Khagan. However, in 800, the Bulgars under Khan Krum invaded, wiping out the Avars. By the 10th century, the Magyars occupied Pannonia, posing a new threat to Charlemagne's descendants. The conquests of the northeastern Slavs. In 789, to assert his dominance over his new pagan neighbors, the Slavs, Charlemagne sent an Austrasian Saxon army across the Elbe River into Obertrite territory. The Slavs immediately submitted, sending their leader, Witzin, to pledge allegiance. Charlemagne accepted the surrender of the Wiltzes under Dragovit and demanded hostages while allowing missionaries to spread Christianity in pagan lands. His army marched to the Baltic before returning along the Rhine, gathering substantial spoils without harassing the local populace. These Slavic tribes became loyal allies. In 795, peace was disrupted by the Saxons, prompting the Abertrite and Wilts leaders to tighten their alliance with their new overlord against the Saxons. Witzin was killed in battle, and Charlemagne avenged him by ravaging the Eastphalians along the Elbe. His successor, Frasuco, led his forces to conquer the Nordalbingians and presented their leaders, who held him in high regard, to Charlemagne. The Abertrites remained loyal to Charlemagne until his death, after which they fought against the Danes. The conquests of the southeastern Slavs. While Charlemagne was preoccupied in Central Europe, he left the Frankish kingdom facing threats from the Avars and Slavs in the southeast. The closest southeastern neighbor to the Franks was Croatia, whose people had settled in Pannonian Croatia and the Duchy of Littoral Croatia. During the wars against the Avars, the Franks called for Croatian support. In the 790s, while Charlemagne waged campaigns against the Avars, He achieved a major victory in 796. Duke Voinomir of Pannonian Croatia supported Charlemagne, and the Franks extended their dominion from Croatia to northern Dalmatia, Slavonia, and Pannonia. Frankish commander Eric of Friuli sought to expand his territory by conquering the Duchy of Littoral Croatia. At the time, Littoral Croatia was ruled by Duke Visislav, one of Croatia's earliest and most renowned leaders. In the Battle of Trsat, Eric's forces were routed from their positions and completely annihilated by Viseslav's troops. Eric himself was among the casualties, and his death, along with his crushing defeat, proved to be a significant setback for the Carolingian Empire. Charlemagne also turned his attention to the Slavic tribes west of the Avar Khaganate, specifically the Carantanians and Carnulans, though these tribes had been subdued by the Lombards and Bavarians and pledged their submission to Charlemagne. They never fully integrated into the Frankish kingdom. The army of the Carolingian Frankish kingdom. According to the traditional customs of the Germanic people, the armed forces of the Carolingians were mobilized for each campaign during the spring and summer. Emperor Charlemagne, as a Frankish lord, had the right to call upon all free men, up to the age of 60, for an expedition. Conscripts were enlisted by head count. If anyone refused to assemble, the fine was severe, and harsh punishments could be applied. But those in charge of inspection and enlistment were often accused of taking bribes and frequently resorted to coercion in the recruitment process. The usual practice was that the army was gathered in spring and would be maintained for 3 to 6 months. The army was assembled in late May to allow the snow to melt from remote areas and for good grass to fatten the horses. Campaigns would be halted during winter, although sieges could still be maintained if deemed necessary. Only the wealthiest among the free men could become warriors, knights, because they had the money to finance their own weapons, military equipment, and troops. They were not paid wages but were compensated with a share of the spoils of war and property taken from defeated enemies. The method of distributing spoils among soldiers was quite common. Most of the spoils naturally went to the nobility, but each soldier could receive his reward when capturing a position or looting the body of a fallen enemy on the battlefield. Vassals swore an oath of office and were granted fiefs. This was a model implemented during the era of Charles Martel, and it continued to expand under Charlemagne. In a period where a self-sufficient economy did not require money and with a primitive administrative structure, the easiest way to maintain a ranking of warriors was to lease land to dependents, those who had just completed military service. The king's direct vassals were usually men from noble families. Charlemagne relied heavily on their service for military purposes, but at the same time, he did not want them to become too independent. Their initial status was insecure and unstable, subject to the king's will. Eventually, the vassals took root in their fiefs and ultimately became important local rulers. The total strength of the Carolingian army may not have been large. Possibly only a few thousand warriors. The vastly exaggerated numbers described by medieval chronicles, depicting thousands of brave knights defeating hundreds of thousands of evil enemies, were written centuries later, thus lacking accuracy. They do not reflect reality but were intended to impress readers through rhetorical, allegorical, and epic styles. Assessing warfare, weaponry, and equipment from the early Frankish period to the time of Charlemagne's kingdom is very difficult due to the scarcity of written records and the fact that most estimates are purely speculative. This is regrettable because it was an era of transformation in military equipment and weaponry, as old styles gradually declined while new ones emerged. Explaining how these changes occurred is challenging, but they likely took place at the end of the Merovingian period and the beginning of the Carolingian era when the Franks fought against the Saracens, Lombards, Aquitanians, and Saxons, leading to some practical influences. One of the most significant military changes was the incorporation of a large number of cavalry into the army. Emperor Charlemagne is certainly credited with developing the famous heavy cavalry of the Franks. Mounted warriors, or milites, who formed the most elite forces, were necessarily drawn from the upper Frankish nobility and their retainers. They were appropriately equipped for war and had to provide for themselves, their men, horses, and weapons. Additionally, they had to supply clothing and food for at least 3 months, along with various equipment such as tents, cooking utensils, shovels, sharp iron stakes, and other essentials for a military campaign. The increasing reliance on cavalry tended to exclude poor free men from combat since full military equipment was quite expensive during Charlemagne's time. Estimates suggest that a good warhorse was worth 12 cows, a high-quality sword with a scabbard equaled 7 cows, a suit of armor was worth 10 cows, a set of spears and shields equaled 2 cows, and a fine aesthetic iron helmet ranged between 4 and 6 cows. Charlemagne was particularly well organized in military logistics. Advance plans were carefully laid out before execution, and supplies were requisitioned a season before the campaign began. Charlemagne maintained supply depots of food, water, fodder, and weapons for his wars against the Saxons in fortified garrisons at Herstel, Eresburg, Boreburg, Fritzlar, and Paderborn. The distances between these depots were reasonable, about a day's or 2 days' travel. Depending on ease of movement or disruptions caused by enemy harassment, the supply convoys allowed the Frankish army to march without needing to forage for food. Officially, looting was prohibited, not for humanitarian reasons but because it slowed the army's movement. In practice, looting generally occurred as a form of punishment against rebel territories and enemies. This could also be part of a larger strategic plan aimed at devastating and crushing the enemy's morale. Charlemagne extensively used intelligence gathered by spies and reviewed it before launching expeditions. These reports included details on the targeted territory, population, geography, methods of warfare, and lifestyle patterns. Such disciplined methods were highly unusual for the time, as later medieval wars were conducted in a much more chaotic manner. Charlemagne's preferred tactic was to divide his forces into 2 or more armies. This strategy was intended to confuse the enemy, and when the Frankish forces regrouped, they would launch an all-out assault on their foes. There are conflicting accounts regarding the combat methods used by Frankish cavalry during Charlemagne's time. Although warriors rode in saddles with full stirrups, it is not necessarily certain that they fully exploited this advantage. Stirrups allowed a knight to use his lance as a powerful thrusting weapon by holding it near the end and bracing it against his body with his right arm. Charlemagne's army may have sometimes used the shock tactics of heavy cavalry, attacking at close range with lances and swords. However, ancient records do not confirm that this tactic was widely employed, and it seems that it was fully developed and successfully utilized in later centuries. Moreover, even if one could determine how many cavalry soldiers were in Charlemagne's army, it is unclear whether they always fought on horseback or simply used horses as a means of rapid transportation. Certainly, battlefield tactics could become sophisticated, with a barricade of sharp stakes in front of archers, infantry assaults, or cavalry charges following an infantry attack. Charlemagne's time was a transitional period in which cavalry warfare techniques were being tested. One notable evolution was the increased use of armor. The Franks traditionally despised armor, relying solely on shields for protection since Clovis's time. But Carolingian soldiers under Charlemagne had become accustomed to wearing armor extensively. During Charlemagne's era, not only the wealthiest soldiers wore protective armor. The burnia or brunia was a leather tunic or a long leather coat, covering much of the body with small metal or thick horn plates sewn onto it. This armor typically extended to the thighs and had an opening in the front for ease of horseback riding. Various helmet styles were used, notably conical iron helmets, sometimes featuring cheek guards and elaborate decorations. To protect their legs, soldiers wore leather bindings, large leather boots, or iron bambergs, greaves. Soldiers carried traditional wooden shields, either oval or round, with a metal boss in the center for additional protection. If logistics, armor, and cavalry forces developed further, offensive weaponry in Charlemagne's time remained largely similar to what the early Franks used. Though with some improvements, spearheads often featured crosspieces to prevent excessive penetration into the enemy's body. Primarily applied to weapons used from horseback. Without a crosspiece, a cavalryman delivering a powerful thrust might be unable to retrieve his weapon from the enemy's body. The use of longswords became widespread and was no longer reserved for commanders as in the early Frankish period. Charlemagne, as a Roman emperor, had his personal guard. These soldiers were chosen from the strongest young noblemen and were distinguished from other warriors. They held privileges and were somewhat regarded as the imperial guard. Their armor resembled that of Roman guards, including chainmail, round shields, and longswords. However, instead of the domed Roman helmets with neck and cheek guards, they wore triangular metal helmets. Allies and dependent peoples. The Carolingian court was an administration that managed a vast territory, and so was its army. A failed campaign, for example, the attack on Zaragoza in 778. The scale of attacks often varied. For instance, in 846, around 11,000 men with 500 warhorses and 73 warships attacked Ostia and Rome. This was likely the regular army of the Achlabid court rather than just an adventurous group. In many aspects, the Saracens' military equipment was superior to that of the Carolingians. Their siege weapons were as modern as those of the Eastern Muslims. By the mid-9th century, they had learned to use Greek fire, a Byzantine naval weapon, at sea and employed it extensively in the 10th century. Their bows evolved from the Roman Syrian composite bow. Saracen attack tactics were complex and deceptive, often employing reserve forces and even secret reserves at pre-planned attack locations. An anonymous historian writing the Salerno Chronicle described them as the most cunning Arabs. Inherently deceitful, and always seeking the devil more than anything else. Despite the failures of Carolingian patronage over the Italians, Lombards, and Franks, Christians benefited from numerous technological advancements and an economic boom, mostly left to fend for themselves with occasional help from the Byzantines. They managed to repel the first waves of Muslim attacks. However, a few years later, the invaders returned with greater ferocity. This time, the Muslims had established military bases in Europe. Some of the most dangerous bases were on a mountain near the Garigliano River in Italy and Fraxington in Provence. The first was destroyed in 915, but the second lasted until 972. Much of Apulia was occupied in the latter half of the 9th century. But the islands of Sicily and Sardinia remained under Muslim control until the 11th century. The Italian city of Naples, nominally under the Byzantine Empire but in reality an independent city, maintained an alliance with the Muslims throughout the 9th and 10th centuries. The city of Salerno also had a looser alliance with the Muslims. The Saracens who seized control of Fraxenitum in Provence were initially invited by one faction in a civil war. Even in Italy and southern France, a significant number of local rulers hired Muslim mercenaries from Libya, Crete, Sicily, and Spain. Many of them eventually settled in the region. The Saracens' main attempt to colonize Italy by force was defeated when their base at Garigliano was destroyed. Despite this, for various reasons, Italy had a stable economy, and its agriculture and trade developed rapidly during the 9th and 10th centuries. The third threat faced by the Byzantine Empire in the 10th century was the Magyars. The Magyars were Finno-Ugric and Turkic peoples who were expelled from their homeland to southern Russia and seemingly lost their entire families, women, children, etc. They settled in Hungary in the late 9th century. Though they were nomads, culturally they were not barbarians. Some were Christians. Others followed Judaism, and their weapon-making craftsmanship was excellent. Despite their misfortunes and nomadic lifestyle, the Magyars maintained trading traditions with the Byzantine Empire and eastern Muslim provinces. Each Magyar tribe was led by a Hadnagy, also known as a duke or prince, who became a member of the governing Arpad Council. Important decisions, such as war and peace, were made by council members, similar to the early Scandinavian pagan assemblies. Their enemies respected them for their strict military discipline. According to the Chronica Hungarorum, the Magyar army was divided into 7 divisions corresponding to their 7 tribes. These divisions were further broken down into units of hundreds and tens. Warfare and plundering subjected Slavic populations, who were forced to settle as farmers. One apparent objective of their raids was to capture women. According to legend, their entire families had been taken when they moved through southern Russia. In their camps, the Magyars used wagons as defensive barriers. In battle, they fought as nomadic horse archers, executing surprise attacks and feigned retreats. They rarely attempted direct assaults on fortresses, preferring to lay siege instead. They also maintained communication between attack groups using smoke signals. A key characteristic of the Magyars was that they did not intend to occupy land permanently. Instead, they used defeated Slavic territories as bases for further incursions. They saw the Bavarians in the west as a threat, particularly the provinces that the Germans still claimed as outposts of the former Carolingian Empire in western Hungary. On the other hand, many rulers in Italy and Germany sought short-term alliances with the Magyars to serve their own interests in civil wars, which ultimately contributed to the downfall of the Carolingian dynasty. The brutality of the Magyar raids once again brought devastation to the Asiatic region, now the Adriatic, which had been relatively untouched for a century compared to the rest of Western Europe. In 900, the Magyars pressured the German borders, then invaded Saxony and Bavaria. By 912, they advanced into Swabia, Thuringia, Lorraine, and even Burgundy in France. Some of them ventured as far as Nîmes and Narbonne in southern France, near Spain. However, Italy was their primary target, a country where counts waged constant, meaningless wars and massacred each other brutally. Popes replaced one another quickly, often corrupt and involved in conflicts. As a result, the Magyars faced little resistance crossing the Alps, and from 921 to 926, they devastated northern Italy and Tuscany. In 937, the Magyars returned to Germany, and in 954, they recklessly rode to the Rhine, crossed the river, and raided the cities of Metz, Cambrai, Reims, and Chalon. Although their forces had diminished, they still laid siege to Augsburg in 955. By this time, the German Emperor Otto I the Great, 936 to 973, a Saxon ruler who benefited from the Carolingian legacy in Germany, had firmly established his power. Otto managed to assemble a powerful army and confronted the invaders at the Battle of Lechfeld, August 10, 955. The battle lasted 10 hours, and Otto emerged victorious. The Magyars fled in chaos, pursued as far as Vienna, and were ultimately scattered. In a single battle, the threat was eliminated, and Magyar horsemen ceased their raids into Germany. The Battle of Lechfeld remains historically significant not only because it halted the advance of nomadic invaders into Western Europe but also because it serves as one of the earliest, if not the first, examples of full-scale medieval cavalry warfare in Western Europe. The barbaric destruction wrought by the Magyars could only be compared to the earlier devastation caused by the Huns. Fields awaiting harvest and farms were burned, livestock was slaughtered, villages and churches were left in ruins, men were killed. Children were slaughtered, and women were raped and murdered. Only castles and fortified locations escaped their attention, as the Magyars lacked siege engines. The Magyars were not numerous, perhaps no more than 20,000 cavalry in total, and their military success can only be attributed to the absence of a centralized power and the weakness, division, and lack of preparation among their opponents. Indeed, as soon as they faced a well-organized force under Emperor Otto, they were defeated in a single battle. Like the Huns, the Magyars were highly skilled horsemen, capable of maneuvering swiftly on the battlefield. Their primary weapon was the powerful short composite bow of Turkic design. Magyar horse archers were exceptional, able to shoot while riding, unlike European cavalry, which had to stop to fire. They also wielded spears, battle axes, and curved swords of Eastern origin. They did not wear armor but instead donned tunics and felt hats, with metal-reinforced helmets for protection. Their arsenal included a variety of weapons and equipment taken from the defeated enemies. In 970, the Magyar leader Géza and his 5,000 warriors accepted baptism from nomadic raiders. They became settlers and established their domain in the Danube basin. Géza's son, Vike, later became King Saint Stephen, 997-1038, who founded the Kingdom of Hungary in 1001. Afterward, the Magyars ceased their raids and began integrating into the European community.